The year is 2483. After decades of warfare and unrelenting devastation at the hands of the Xerax Dominion, humanity's last hope resides in the depths of a massive, isolated space station called Solis. Orbiting the lifeless moon of a forgotten planet, Solis is a place of science, desperation, and resistance. The human race, now scattered and near extinction, has been pushed to the brink of annihilation. Only a handful of planets remain under human control, each one threatened by the ever-encroaching Dominion. Dr. Evangeline Rios, once a leading biotechnologist on Earth, now works tirelessly within the hidden labs of Solis. Years of research had led her to a breakthrough. The key to saving humanity might not lie in weapons or technology, but in the very essence of human biology itself. The answer was buried in the genetic code of every human, a dormant strand of DNA left by ancient ancestors, an unrecognized inheritance. It was a remnant of the evolutionary path that had allowed humanity to rise from a primitive species to one of the most adaptable and resilient in the galaxy. This dormant power had the potential to elevate the human race beyond their physical and mental limits, even surpassing the Xerax in strength. But the potential for godlike power came with its own risks Dr. Rios had no choice but to explore. Late one night, as the sound of distant explosions from an incoming Xerax assault echoed through the station's reinforced walls, Dr. Rios made her decision. The window for survival was closing fast. There would be no time to test the theory or refine the process. With the guidance of a few trusted colleagues, she moved forward with an accelerated program to activate the latent powers within human DNA. But it wasn't just theory anymore. It was happening. The experiment was live. Her first test subjects were volunteers, those who had lost everything, who were willing to take a leap into the unknown. They were part of the station's skeleton crew, soldiers, scientists, civilians. Each one had been through the hellish battles of humanity's last stand. They knew this might be their final act. Some of them had been preparing for death, others for a miracle. As Dr. Rios administered the injection, a serum designed to awaken the dormant gene, the human subjects felt nothing at first. No burning sensation, no shifting of reality. But then it happened. Their hearts began to race, their bodies surged with energy, and their minds expanded. It was as if a dam had been broken within them, and torrents of unknown abilities rushed forward. For one, it was the power to manipulate energy fields with mere thoughts. For another, it was an enhanced sense of perception, able to see the subatomic structure of the universe. But for some, the transition was too much. Their minds couldn't handle the rush of newfound power, and they spiraled into uncontrollable madness. It was a chaotic, horrifying sight. Dr. Rios watched helplessly, her pulse quickening. Some of the volunteers, now empowered beyond reason, began to lash out. One of them, a former soldier named Marcus, smashed through a reinforced wall with nothing but his fists. The others followed, their powers unchecked, as they fought both the station's walls and each other. The next few hours were a blur of scientific failure and terrifying success. Humanity had unlocked Godhood, but at a cost. Those who survived were forever altered, their bodies no longer entirely human, yet somehow more than human. In the chaos, a signal came in from the Xerax. A fleet was en route, and it was headed straight for Solis. The Harbingers, the name Dr. Rios now gave to the first group of ascended humans, had no time to process their newfound abilities. They had only one choice: fight. With the station on the verge of destruction, Captain Ian Halloway, a seasoned war hero now leading the survivors of Solis, took charge. He had heard the rumors of what was happening in the labs, But seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. His once human crew had become something new, something terrifying. As the Xerax fleet arrived on the horizon, it was no longer just humanity's will to survive on the line. Their very nature had changed, and with it, the war would never be the same again. The Xerax would soon learn that humanity was no longer the fragile species they had once been, and they would fear the ascended humans, those harbingers who could bend reality to their will. But first, humanity would have to learn how to control their new power, or risk destroying everything they had left. The Solace shook violently as the Xerax fleet arrived in full force, dark ships blotting out the stars in the distance. The battle that followed would be like none other, for humanity was no longer just the underdog, fighting with crude weapons and desperate tactics. No, now humanity had something far greater, an ascended power, a force that was barely understood, but felt through every nerve, every molecule of their being. Captain Ian Holloway stood at the command center of Solace, watching as the Harbingers, the newly ascended humans, prepared for their first real test. His mind raced, torn between awe and fear at what these new warriors could accomplish. They had been given a gift, but gifts this powerful often came at a terrible price. How long before they lost control? How long before they became the very thing they fought against? "Captain, the Xerax are closing in," said Lieutenant Sarah Voss, her eyes locked on the holographic display, where Xerax ships loomed ever closer. "They'll be within firing range in 15 minutes. Holloway nodded, his jaw set. "It's time," he said. "Bring the Harbingers to the front lines. They'll make the first strike." In the main hall, the Harbingers were preparing. Dr. Evangeline Rios paced nervously, watching as the warriors who had once been her colleagues and friends now stood before her, each one displaying strange new abilities. Some shimmered with energy, their bodies barely contained by the raw force within them. Others had strange markings on their skin, symbols of their transformation. "We have no choice," Holloway said, entering the room. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. "We're fighting for our survival. Today, we show the Xerax that we're no longer the hunted. We are the hunters." He looked at each of them, his gaze lingering on the soldiers who had once followed him into battle. They were different now, more than human, and yet, beneath the glowing auras and altered senses, they were still his team. "Everyone ready?" he asked, his voice carrying authority. A chorus of affirmatives rang out, each harbinger ready to do whatever it took. Holloway stepped aside, allowing them to move into position. The plan was simple: break the Xerax fleet's defensive perimeter with overwhelming force. The Harbingers would charge forward, using their newfound powers to disable enemy ships and clear the way for a full assault. But as he watched them leave, Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that they might be stepping into something far worse than they imagined. As the first Xerax ships entered firing range, the Harbingers initiated their attack. The power they unleashed was nothing short of spectacular. Sergeant Nadia Kaler, her form shimmering with raw energy, reached out with a flick of her hand. A massive Xerax ship was immediately wrenched out of its path, its engines flaring as it was crushed into the hull of a nearby destroyer. The impact caused a chain reaction, tearing the enemy ships apart in an explosion of light and fire. "Firing solution complete, Captain," Lieutenant Voss reported. "The Harbingers are in control of the battlefield. They're disrupting their fleet." The rest of the Harbingers unleashed their powers in synchronized precision. One Harbinger, Jace Donovan, tore apart the Xerax command vessel's communication array with a focused energy beam from his eyes. Another, Alina Torsk, telekinetically disarmed an entire squadron of Xerax soldiers before decimating their battle armor with a surge of electrical energy from her hands. On the bridge of the Xerax flagship, the warlord Zrathaolus watched in disbelief as his forces were torn apart by mere humans, now empowered beyond recognition. His red, alien eyes glowed with fury. Impossible, he hissed, slamming his fist onto the console. No mortal race should wield such power. But the Xerax were not the only ones watching. Far from the front lines, in the deepest recesses of the Solus, Dr. Rios stared at the battle unfolding on her screen, her heart racing. The results were more than she had anticipated. Her subjects were evolving faster than even she could track. But the raw potential of their new abilities frightened her. How long will it be before they became uncontrollable? How long before humanity itself was no longer human? In the midst of the battle, Holloway received an encrypted message from an unknown source. It was a warning. You are not the first to ascend. You are not the first to challenge the Xerax. The path you walk has been trodden by countless civilizations before you. Beware the price of your power. Holloway's pulse quickened as he looked at the message. The warning was clear. The Ascension might not be a blessing. It might be a curse. The Xerax, it seemed, were not the only ones who feared humanity's new godlike potential. As the battle raged on, and the Harbingers pushed their newfound powers to the limit, Holloway realized the harsh truth. The war had changed, and the human race was now playing a dangerous game. The Xerax weren't just an enemy to be defeated. They were a reflection of the path humanity might take if they weren't careful. And the cost of victory might be far greater than any of them realized. The battle was won. For the first time in years, humanity tasted victory, and yet it felt hollow. The Xerax fleet had been obliterated, their forces scattered and disoriented, but the cost was evident. The Harbingers, humanity's new gods, had unleashed powers that bent space itself, and yet they were not unscathed. In the aftermath of the battle, Captain Holloway surveyed the damage, his mind heavy with uncertainty. The Harbingers had demonstrated extraordinary abilities. Sergeant Nadia Keller had shattered entire Xerax warships with a thought, while Jace Donovan had disintegrated an entire Xerax battalion with a single burst of focused energy. But the victory was not without consequence. The battlefield was littered with the aftermath of destruction. Pieces of the once proud Solus floating in the void, shattered by the force of the Harbinger's unleashed powers. The Xerax had been defeated, but the humans had crossed a line, one that they might never be able to return from. Captain, Dr. Evangeline Rios approached, her face pale and drawn. We need to talk. The Ascension, it's progressing too quickly. Holloway turned to face her, his face a mask of exhaustion. I know, he said quietly. The battle was too easy. They're too strong. Dr. Rios nodded, the weight of her own guilt evident. That's just it, Diane. They're becoming something else. Their powers, some of them are out of control. Nadia can't even control her energy manipulation anymore. It's leaking into everything she touches. Jace, he's losing himself in his telekinesis. He's tearing apart the very ship we're on. I'm afraid that if this keeps going, they'll be irreversibly changed, and not in the way we intended. Holloway's mind raced. The Ascension process had been a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to level the playing field with the Xerax, but now he was seeing the dark side of that gamble. The new powers were too great, too unstable. Humanity had crossed a threshold, and they were teetering on the edge of something far worse than extinction. They were becoming something unrecognizable. We need to rein it in, Holloway said, his voice tight with determination. We can't let them lose control. If they do, they'll become the very thing we've been fighting against. Dr. Rios nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes was clear. But I don't know how to reverse it. The Ascension was never meant to be undone. It's irreversible, Ian. Suddenly, a voice came over the comm system, sharp and urgent. "Captain, we have a situation." Lieutenant Voss's voice crackled through the speakers. "Jace Donovan. He's gone rogue. He's tearing apart the lower decks." Holloway's heart sank. "Damn it," he muttered, before speaking into the comm. "Voss, get a containment team down there. I'll be there in a minute." He turned to Dr. Rios, his eyes grim. "I have to go. I need you to stay here and keep monitoring the others. We need a solution, fast." Dr. Rios watched him leave, a feeling of dread gnawing at her. She knew what was coming. The Jaraks were just the beginning. If humanity couldn't control its newfound powers, it would tear itself apart from the inside out. Captain Holloway made his way through the ship, the corridors eerily silent after the chaos of the battle. The lights flickered as the ship's systems strained to recover from the damage. As he approached the lower decks, he could hear the sounds of destruction. A low rumble, followed by the sharp crack of metal bending under tremendous force. "Jace," Holloway shouted, his voice carrying through the halls. Donovan's voice came in response, cold and distant. "You don't understand, Captain. I'm seeing everything. Everything at once. I can bend reality, shape it to my will. It's so beautiful, Lan. So pure." Holloway's pulse quickened. The power had corrupted him. Jace wasn't just losing control. He was losing himself to the very power they had sought to harness. "Jace, stop this," Holloway called, moving closer to the source of the destruction. "You're not a god. You're still human. Remember who you are." But Jace's laughter echoed through the ship, hollow and unsettling. "Human. Ha. I am beyond that now. We all are. Why should we fight for survival when we can just make everything bend to us?" The captain's heart sank as he rounded the corner, coming face to face with the once heroic soldier, now standing in the heart of the destruction. Jace's eyes glowed with a strange energy, his hands crackling with power. Pieces of the ship floated around him, suspended in mid-air as though obeying his will. He was no longer the man Holloway had fought beside. He was something else, something alien. "Jace, you're not in control anymore," Holloway said, his voice soft but firm. "This isn't you. You're letting the power consume you." Jace's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Holloway thought he saw a flicker of recognition. But then the moment passed, and the dark power surged once more. "You don't understand," Jace said, his voice trembling with the strain of his inner battle. "I can feel it, Ian. I'm becoming something more. I can see everything. I can reshape reality itself." With a wave of his hand, a wall of energy shot toward Holloway, forcing him to dive for cover. The ship trembled as the power cascaded down the hull, sending sparks flying from the walls. Holloway knew what he had to do, but he wasn't sure if he could. The battle wasn't just against the Jaraks anymore. It was a battle for the soul of humanity itself. The situation had escalated beyond Holloway's control. Jace Donovan stood at the heart of the devastation, his once human form now a conduit for an unimaginable force. Power surged from him like a storm, rending the ship's structure and twisting reality around him. The very air vibrated with the tension of the energy coursing through his body. Captain Holloway crouched behind a collapsed bulkhead, heart pounding. Jace's transformation wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, mental, and emotional. He knew Jace. He had fought beside him for years. But now, the man he called comrade was slipping away into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. "Jace," Holloway shouted again, pushing his fear down, his voice steady and filled with a sense of urgency. "This is madness. You're letting it control you." Jace's eyes flickered with something that almost resembled recognition. For a fleeting second, Holloway saw the man he had known, Jace, the soldier who had saved his life countless times. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold, distant gaze of someone, or something, that was far beyond them both. Control? Jace's voice was no longer the one Holloway had known. It was deeper, reverberating with power. "I am control. I have seen the threads of the universe, Captain. I can rewrite them if I want. Everything is mine to command." The walls groaned as another surge of energy twisted the ship around them. Holloway's mind raced. How could he reach Jace? He couldn't just fight him, not like this. Jace was no longer the man he had once been. He was a force of nature, as dangerous as any alien invader. But there was still a chance, wasn't there? A part of him was still human. Holloway had to believe that. Suddenly, Jace turned, sensing Holloway's presence. The energy around him pulsed, an almost physical manifestation of his raw power. "You still don't understand, do you, Ian? Humanity has always been weak, but now we have ascended. We've become more than we ever could have dreamed. There's no going back from this." Holloway's mind whirred as he tried to formulate a plan. He had to make Jace see reason. He had to. But how? How could one person stand against something that could reshape reality itself? "You were always about the mission, Jace." "About protecting humanity," Holloway said, his voice full of resolve. "But what you're doing now, it's destroying everything we fought for. You're no longer protecting humanity. You're becoming a tyrant. Don't you see that?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, Jace's voice broke through, laced with a strange sorrow. "I am not a tyrant, Ian. I am evolution. I am what we were always meant to be. We were human, but now we are gods." Holloway took a step forward, pushing past the rising tide of fear in his chest. "You were human," he said quietly, "and you still are, somewhere inside." There was a flicker, just a flicker, of the old Jace. A brief flash of the soldier who had once fought beside him, the friend who had stood at his side when all seemed lost. It was enough. Holloway knew that deep down, Jace was still there, fighting against the power that was overwhelming him. But Jace was struggling, and he was losing. "You're fighting it, Jace," Holloway said, his voice soft but firm. "You have to fight it. Don't let this power destroy you. It's not too late." For a moment, Jace's body shuddered, his hands trembling as the energy within him seemed to reach its breaking point. His eyes glowed brighter, but there was a flicker of doubt in them. He was listening. Holloway could feel it. But then, the energy surged again, overwhelming Jace's will. His form twisted, and a loud, painful cry ripped through the air. It wasn't just Jace's voice anymore. It was the voice of something greater, something beyond his control. "I can't hold it back." Jace screamed. "I can't. It's too much." Holloway barely had time to react. Jace flung his arm out in a final, desperate attempt to release his power. The air thickened, crackling with energy, and Holloway was thrown backward as an explosion of force detonated in all directions. When the dust cleared, Holloway found himself on the floor, dazed but alive. The area around him was unrecognizable. Twisted metal, shattered walls, and scorched surfaces. Jace was gone, or at least his human form was. Only a glowing, crackling core of energy remained in his place, hovering eerily above the wreckage. Holloway slowly got to his feet, his body aching. He glanced around, seeing that the containment team had arrived. Too late. They were looking at the hovering core with a mix of awe and horror. The crew members were trained to deal with disasters, but nothing could have prepared them for this. "Captain," Voss said, her voice shaky. What do we do now?" Holloway swallowed hard, his mind racing. He looked at the core, at the power that had once been Jace Donovan. The ship was still intact, but they were now facing something more dangerous than any Xarax fleet. The power to reshape the universe itself was no longer something humanity could hope to control. It was a threat to their very existence. "We stop it," Holloway said, his voice cold. "We stop it before it destroys everything we've ever known." But deep down, he wondered if they were already too late. Humanity had ascended, but had they ascended to salvation or to their doom? The core that had once been Jace Donovan hung in the air, pulsing with a terrifying energy that seemed to shift the very fabric of reality around it. Captain Holloway and his crew stood in stunned silence, their eyes locked on the glowing mass. It wasn't just a weapon. It wasn't even just power. It was something deeper, something fundamental, like a key to the universe itself, a force that could either build or unmake everything humanity had fought for. "Captain," Lieutenant Voss said, her voice shaking as she stared at the pulsating core, "what are we supposed to do with this? How do we contain it?" Holloway didn't have an answer. He could feel the raw, unbridled energy emanating from the core, pressing against him, tugging at the very edges of his mind. It felt like it was alive, as though it was constantly seeking something beyond their comprehension. Jace had become this thing, and in doing so, humanity had unlocked a power they couldn't begin to understand. "I don't know," Holloway muttered, "but we can't let it out of here. If this thing spreads, it will destroy everything." Dr. Rios interrupted, her voice suddenly sounding more certain. She had appeared behind them, her eyes locked on the core. "It's a concentration of the Ascension energy. Jace, he didn't just gain powers. He transcended, becoming the embodiment of this force. If we can't contain it, we risk unleashing a chain reaction that could tear apart the entire station." Holloway's mind reeled. They were facing a power far beyond the control of any human. He could see it in Dr. Rios's eyes. She had spent years studying the Ascension process, but even she was now unsure of how to stop it. "What happened to him?" Holloway asked, struggling to maintain his focus as the energy in the room became overwhelming. What was it that changed him? Dr. Rios's eyes were filled with a sorrowful understanding. The Ascension, it's not just an increase in power. It's a reawakening of something ancient within us. The power we unlocked was dormant in the human genome, but we didn't realize the full extent of it. It was always there, buried deep within us, a gift from a forgotten time, from an earlier stage of our evolution. But Jace, he pushed too far. He didn't just unlock his potential. He tried to transcend his humanity. The process wasn't meant for this level of power. The words struck Holloway like a blow to the chest. Jace had tried to become more than human, and in doing so, he had become something alien, something beyond their ability to control. The power they had unleashed had no limits, no boundaries, and if they didn't stop it soon, it would spiral beyond their comprehension, and beyond any chance of survival. "How do we reverse this?" Voss asked, her voice pleading now. "How do we stop it before it spreads?" "I don't know," Dr. Rios admitted, her voice thick with regret. "But we may not have the luxury of time to find a solution. The Ascension isn't just about power. It's about understanding reality itself. And once it starts, once it accelerates, it's unstoppable. Jace was the first to transcend. But there may be others." Holloway's stomach sank as he realized the magnitude of what Dr. Rios was suggesting. They weren't just facing one rogue harbinger. They were looking at the potential for a new generation of ascended humans, each one capable of warping the fabric of space and time itself. If there were others like Jace, if the Ascension spread, humanity's fight for survival might be over before it even began. "We can't let that happen," Holloway said, his voice sharp with urgency. "If this power spreads, the Zarax won't be our only enemy. We'll be fighting ourselves." Dr. Rios nodded grimly. "And worse, we may lose ourselves entirely. The Ascension could create a rift in human consciousness, a fracture in what it means to be human. We would be no better than the Zarax, enslaved by our own hubris." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. The solution was as clear as it was terrifying. They needed to contain the power within the core before it spread further. But how? How could they contain something so vast, so all-encompassing? Suddenly, the station's alarms blared, interrupting their conversation. Holloway's heart skipped a beat. "Captain, we've got another breach," Voss shouted, her voice tinged with panic. "Another harbinger, one of the Ascended, has lost control. We can't contain them. They're tearing through the ship." Holloway didn't need to hear more. He snapped into action, motioning for the crew to follow him. "Dr. Rios, come with me. We need to stop this before it spreads further. Voss, get the containment team to the breach point. We need to contain the Ascended before they destroy everything." As they rushed through the hallways of Solace, Holloway's mind raced. Another harbinger had lost control, just like Jace. And this time, they wouldn't be able to stop the chain reaction without extreme measures. He knew they had only one choice. They would have to confront the Ascended directly and risk everything to prevent a catastrophe. He could only hope that humanity's survival wasn't lost along the way. The sawdust trembled beneath Holloway's feet as he and Dr. Rios sprinted through the ship's winding hallways. The emergency lights flickered in time with the alarms, casting an eerie red glow across their path. The ship had become a war zone, and the harbingers, the Ascended humans, had turned their immense power against their own. "How many of them are there?" Holloway asked, breathless, as they rounded a corner. He knew the answer before Dr. Rios even spoke it, but he needed confirmation. "3, Dr. Rios replied grimly. "3 Ascended have lost control. Jace was the first, and now they're all following in his wake. If we don't stop them, we'll be facing a chain reaction. We could lose the entire fleet, Captain." Holloway's mind raced. 3 harbingers had ascended, each one powerful beyond belief. And now they were nothing more than living weapons, their humanity slipping away under the weight of their own power. They had been the saviors, the ones who would carry humanity forward into a new age. But now they were the harbingers of its destruction. "Where are they?" Holloway pressed, his voice sharp. "Decks 7, 9, and 12, Dr. Rios responded. "But the one on Deck 7, it's worse. His powers are so far out of control that the station's structural integrity is failing in his area. We could lose the entire section if we don't act quickly." Holloway nodded, his face set in determination. "We'll contain them. We'll stop them before they tear the ship apart. But we need to move fast." They reached the command center, where Lieutenant Voss was already coordinating the crew's response. The tension in the air was palpable. Crew members scrambled to activate containment fields and isolate the areas where the Ascended were wreaking havoc. But it was clear from the looks on their faces, there was no guarantee of success. The situation was beyond anything they had trained for. "Captain," Voss said, her voice low but filled with urgency, "we've tried everything we can to contain the Ascended. They're breaking through the barriers like they're nothing. The power they wield it's unlike anything we've ever seen. Hathaway gripped the edge of the command table, trying to steady his nerves. They were dealing with a power that not only bent physical laws, but now seemed to transcend even the laws of the human mind. The Harbinger's powers were so vast, so unpredictable, that they could reshape reality itself in an instant. "We need to isolate them," Hathaway said, his mind working overtime. "We need to bring them back to themselves before it's too late." Dr. Rios's eyes widened. "You mean reverse the ascension? Captain, you know that's impossible. Once the process reaches a certain threshold, there's no going back. We're dealing with something that transcends their bodies, their minds. These people, Jace included, they've evolved into something entirely different, something we can't even begin to understand." Hathaway's heart tightened as the weight of her words sank in. They were trying to stop something they didn't even have a name for, a force that had already started to tear apart the very fabric of humanity. There was no going back for Jace, and now there might be no going back for the others. "We don't have a choice," he said quietly, his voice full of resolve. "We have to stop them, or the whole station will come apart. And if we let them get to the rest of the fleet, it's over for all of us." He turned toward Voss, who was coordinating the crew's efforts. "Prepare to deploy containment measures on Deck 7, he ordered. "And tell the others on Deck 9 and Deck 12 to get ready. We'll need to move fast." As Voss moved to relay the order, Hathaway turned back to Dr. Rios. "Is there anything we can do? Anything at all?" Dr. Rios's face was pale, her brow furrowed in thought. "There may be one thing," she said slowly. "It's dangerous, but it might work. If we can destabilize the energy core inside the Ascended, it could force their powers into a dormant state. It won't reverse the Ascension, but it might render them powerless long enough for us to restrain them." Hathaway nodded. "Then we do it. Now." They didn't have time to waste. As they rushed toward Deck 7, the ship's vibrations became more pronounced. Hathaway could feel the increasing pressure of the station's structural failure. If they didn't act quickly, the entire section would be lost. He could only hope that they would be able to find a way to stop the Ascended before they turned the Solace into their tomb. When they arrived on Deck 7, the scene was chaos. The walls had begun to buckle under the force of the Ascended's powers. The very air shimmered with the unnatural energy that radiated from one of their own, Private Liam Quinn, a once promising soldier, now twisted by the power he had unleashed. His body was surrounded by a field of crackling energy, his eyes wide with confusion and pain. "Liam!" Hathaway shouted, stepping forward. "Fight it, man. You don't have to do this." For a moment, Quinn's eyes seemed to focus on him. There was a flicker of recognition, a moment of humanity. But then the energy surged again, and the man Hathaway had known disappeared, replaced by something alien. "You can't stop me." Quinn's voice was low and distorted, barely human. "I'm beyond you now, beyond all of you." Hathaway's chest tightened. They couldn't reason with him. There was no returning to what they had been, but there was one way to stop this. "Now, Dr. Rios," Hathaway barked. Dr. Rios activated the destabilization device, sending a pulse of energy toward Quinn's core. The Ascended soldier screamed, his form crackling with uncontrollable power. The ship groaned under the strain, but Hathaway's heart skipped a beat as Quinn's power began to destabilize. It was working. But they weren't out of danger yet. The ship was on the verge of collapse, and the other Ascended were still out there. If they didn't act fast, the Solace and humanity's future would be lost. The energy around Quinn exploded in a burst of violent light, sending Hathaway and Dr. Rios tumbling backward. The shockwave rattled the very bones of the Solus, and the walls buckled under the force of the power that was now collapsing in on itself. Quinn, his body surrounded by the glowing aura of his ascended form, screamed in agony as his energy core destabilized. His figure wavered, flickering between human and something otherworldly. Holloway pushed himself to his feet, his ears ringing from the blast. The air was thick with ozone, the smell of burning metal and singed wiring assaulting his senses. Quinn's form was now flickering, the energy around him destabilizing. It wasn't just the power that was the threat anymore. It was everything that it was doing to the very fabric of reality. If they didn't act soon, even Quinn's collapsing energy field could take down the entire deck. "Is it working?" Holloway shouted over the roar of the destabilizing energy. Dr. Rios's face was pale, her hands shaking as she recalibrated the device. "It's working, but it's unstable. We need to move him before the core collapses entirely." Holloway didn't need to hear more. He rushed forward, grabbing Quinn by the shoulders. The once proud soldier's eyes were wide and empty, his mouth moving, but no words came out, only the desperate, agonized screech of raw, unrestrained power. Holloway's heart pounded in his chest as he hauled Quinn's collapsing form toward the containment pod that had been hurriedly deployed. But as he moved, Quinn's body spasmed violently, releasing another shockwave of energy that slammed Holloway back into the wall. His body collided with the metal hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. "You have to hold on, Quinn." Holloway grunted, pushing himself back to his feet. The ship was shaking, and the alarms were blaring louder than ever. Time was running out. They couldn't contain the explosion for long. Through the haze of pain, Holloway could see Dr. Rios working frantically on a backup control panel, sweat dripping down her forehead as she recalculated the pulse to stabilize Quinn. But even with her expertise, there was a limit to how much the station could handle. They were playing with forces they could barely understand. "Captain, you need to hurry." Voss's voice came through the comms, sharp and urgent. "The station's systems are failing across the board. If Quinn's energy detonates, Deck 7 will tear apart in seconds. We won't even be able to launch evacuation pods before the breach reaches the core." Holloway glanced back to the containment pod. The shimmering energy around Quinn had begun to pulse erratically, and the ship's walls groaned in protest. They had moments at most before Deck 7 was lost. He turned back to Quinn, whose once human face was now contorted with torment. This wasn't just about saving the Solus anymore. It was about saving humanity from itself. If they failed here, this would be the first of many Ascension disasters. If they couldn't contain Quinn, the others would be beyond saving, and humanity's desperate race to evolve would be the very thing that doomed them. With remorse, Holloway threw himself forward again, grabbing Quinn's body once more and dragging him toward the containment pod. The soldier's weight felt heavier than ever, but Holloway didn't stop. He couldn't stop. "Dr. Rios, do it now," he barked. Rios slammed her fist on the control panel. A surge of power shot through the pod, and for a brief moment, the energy around Quinn seemed to shudder. His body arched violently, as if the very core of his being was fighting to break free. And then, just as it seemed the entire station was on the verge of exploding, a force field snapped around Quinn, locking him within the pod. The light flared once more, and then it dimmed. The core stabilized, the energy dissipating into nothingness. Holloway collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His body ached, every muscle screaming from the toll of the fight. His mind was reeling from the close call. They had done it. For now. Dr. Rios took a shaky breath, wiping sweat from her brow. That was too close. Hathaway nodded grimly, still unable to catch his breath. But they weren't done yet. Quinn was contained, but the other two Ascended still roamed the ship, their powers growing more erratic by the second. If they didn't act quickly, the solace would fall to them as well. "We've got to move," Hathaway said, his voice rough but determined. "Get the containment pods ready for decks 9 and 12. Voss, coordinate the teams. We need to secure the other two Ascended before they tear this ship apart." Voss's voice came through the comms, steady but urgent. "Already on it, Captain. We'll be ready, but we're running out of time. You need to act fast." Hathaway didn't hesitate. The time for second thoughts had passed. The Ascended were no longer human. They had transcended to something beyond the reach of regular men. But that didn't mean they had won, not yet. With one last look at Quinn's contained form, Hathaway turned and raced toward the next breach. The fight for humanity's future had only just begun. The hallways of Solace were eerily quiet as Hathaway made his way toward Deck 9. The ship was still shaking, the aftershocks of the Ascended's powers reverberating through the walls. The station's structural integrity was hanging by a thread, and every moment was a gamble. If they didn't contain the remaining two Ascended, they would lose everything. The entire fleet could be at risk. "Captain, we've initiated the containment procedures on Deck 9. Voss's voice crackled through the comms. "But we're facing heavy resistance. They're not going down easily. We need backup." Hathaway's eyes narrowed. It was no surprise that the Ascended were fighting back. After all, they had evolved beyond human limitations. They were no longer the men and women who had once been part of humanity. They were something far more dangerous. "We're on our way," Hathaway replied, his voice hard with determination. "Prepare for a full assault. We can't let them destroy the Solace." He reached Deck 9 just as the sound of distant explosions echoed through the walls. The containment teams were doing everything they could to hold the Ascended back, but it wasn't enough. There were too many variables, too many ways things could go wrong. The first of the Ascended, Private Ella Marks, was waiting for them. Once a bright and capable officer, she was now a vessel of unimaginable pallor, her body crackling with energy. Her eyes glowed with a fierce, almost manic intensity. Her form shimmered, constantly changing, her human features warping into something alien and incomprehensible. "You think you can stop me?" Ella's voice echoed, no longer the voice of a soldier, but something other, something vast and unknowable. "You can't even understand what I've become." Hathaway stepped forward, his pulse steadying as he prepared for the confrontation. "Ella, I know who you are. You're still human. You have to fight this." For a brief moment, her features softened, her eyes flickering with recognition. But then, as the energy within her flared, she hissed, her human side consumed by the raw power she wielded. "Humanity is weak," she spat. "I'm beyond you now. Beyond all of you." The crackling energy around her exploded outward, and Hathaway had to dive to the side to avoid the blast. The entire deck shuddered as the force of the attack reverberated throughout the ship. "Captain, we can't hold much longer." Voss's voice came through the comms, full of desperation. "If we don't subdue her soon, Deck 9 will implode." Hathaway quickly assessed the situation. They had no time to waste. The only option was to fight fire with fire. They had to disable Ella's energy core before it consumed the entire station. He glanced over at Dr. Rios, who was now standing behind him, her face pale but resolute. She was the key to stopping the Ascended. She could rewire their cores if they could get close enough. "We need to get her into the containment field," Hathaway said, making a snap decision. "Dr. Rios, can you do it?" Dr. Rios nodded, her eyes steely with determination. I can disable her energy field temporarily, but we'll need to hold her long enough to trigger the containment pod. Once she's inside, we can neutralize the power. Holloway didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon, firing a burst of stun rounds toward Ella. The blasts hit her, but they did little more than disrupt her form for a fraction of a second before the energy around her regenerated. She howled in fury, retaliating with a wave of energy that sent Holloway flying across the room. "I won't be contained," Ella screeched, her voice now a distorted echo of its former self. But the fight was far from over. The containment team was regrouping, moving in from the rear to flank Ella. The only chance they had was to wear her down. They needed to tire her out, to force her energy to destabilize, and then... A sudden thought flashed through Holloway's mind. If Ella was anything like Quinn, her core was unstable. They didn't need to destroy her power. They just needed to push her past the threshold, the point where the energy would collapse in on itself. "Dr. Rios," Holloway shouted. "Use the destabilizer. Now." Dr. Rios didn't waste a second. She activated the device she had used on Quinn, sending a pulse of energy toward Ella. The effect was instantaneous. Ella's body jerked, and a strangled scream tore from her throat as the energy core within her began to fluctuate wildly. For a moment, the room was bathed in blinding light, and the walls shook with the force of the energy eruption. "Get her to the pod," Holloway barked. Voss and the rest of the containment team surged forward, wrestling with the wild, thrashing form of Ella. The energy around her crackled as it began to destabilize, the light of her power flickering like a dying star. They didn't have much time. They had to get her contained. With a final, desperate push, they managed to throw Ella into the containment pod. The force field snapped into place, locking her inside. The energy around her flickered, dimming to a weak pulse before it faded entirely. Holloway exhaled in relief, his heart pounding. But he knew this wasn't over yet. The last Ascended was still out there, Private Jason Howe. And as powerful as Ella was, Howe had proven to be even more unpredictable. "Voss, we're moving to Deck 12, Holloway ordered. "Prepare for the last containment. This ends now." The final battle was upon them, and whether humanity survived would depend on how they dealt with the last of their own, turned against them by the very power they had sought to harness. Holloway steeled himself for the next confrontation. The dawn of a new era was coming, but it wasn't guaranteed that humanity would see the sunrise. The fight for survival was only beginning.